Okay, third and final part of the Theme 2 mock exam. This is going on forever and ever. It's like Lord of the Rings, but it will finally finish here. So, second to last question. Discuss the likely impact of both a lack of new investment and an appreciation of the pound on inflationary pressures in the UK. Now, inflationary pressures means the pressure of inflation. So it means discuss the impact of both of these things on what will happen to the level of inflation. If we say there are a lot of inflationary pressures, it means we're saying there's a lot of inflation. So will these two factors cause inflation to go up or down? That's what's asking us. Let's start with the investment one. If there's a lack of new investment, that means businesses are not purchasing new capital. If businesses don't purchase new capital like machinery, new factories, new vans, etc., over time these things will get worn down. There's wear and tear. Whenever you use anything, an old computer, an old car, things get broken. Imagine if you have a very old car, it's probably going to end up breaking all the time. You're going to end up spending so much money fixing it that you might as well just buy a new one. So if businesses are not investing, if they're not buying new machinery and capital goods in general, then this will ultimately push their costs up, because breakages will happen, they will be using raw materials inefficiently, and so ultimately it pushes their costs up. Now, what does that have to do with inflationary pressure? Well, if costs go up, we know that aggregate supply goes down, and if aggregate supply goes down, this can cause prices to rise, and when supply goes down and prices rise, this is called cost push inflation. So yes, you could say a lack of new investment would cause an increase in inflation. It would be cost push inflation. And it's very important when discussing inflation to mention the specific types. Looking over to this one, an appreciation of the pound, right? If the pound gets stronger, that means exports will go down, but imports will go up. Now, if you remember the aggregate demand equation, AD equals CIGX minus M, if our imports go up and our exports go down, this actually lowers aggregate demand. It doesn't increase aggregate demand. So as the pound gets stronger, that's going to lower aggregate demand. So instead of increasing inflation, if AD goes down, then this means inflation also goes down. We're reducing demand pull inflation. So one of them could increase inflation and one could lower inflation. Now, because it's discussed the likely impact, we're going to have to throw in a few evaluation points here. I could say that the pound appreciating, although that in itself could have an effect on lowering inflation, AD is made up of a number of different components, and in fact imports and exports are not the biggest part, it's consumption that's the biggest part. And so if consumer spending is increasing while the pound appreciates, this could still lead to demand pull inflation. So throwing in an evaluation point there, after explaining what both of those things are, that's going to be very helpful in increasing our marks. Now, we're on to the final question. And here we have a choice. We can either do the top one or the bottom one. I'm going to discuss both. I'm going to start with the top one here. So I think the best thing to do with this is I'm going to show you the mark scheme for both of these questions, and I'm going to discuss the answer while we look at the mark scheme, because it's probably easier to kind of follow that way. So F, evaluate whether the UK government should focus on achieving economic growth as its key macroeconomic objective. So we know the government has multiple macroeconomic objectives, but should growth be the main one? Well, the way I would tackle this is I would start by saying yes, why growth is very important, all the positive effects that growth has, and then I'd switch it over and go, well, actually, too much growth can cause these negative things. So let's have a look at how the Marx scheme lays everything out. Here we go. So they want you to start by showing an understanding of economic growth. So I'd say economic growth is judged based on GDP. An increase in GDP within the UK economy equals economic growth. The government has a target of sustained growth. So they want the economy to be growing every year. There are various macroeconomic objectives that the government has. These include growth, low unemployment, low and steady inflation, balance of current account, etc., etc. So showing that you know what growth is and that what these objectives are, that's going to get you some of these knowledge marks at the top. Now, we're going to start with the positives about growth. So let's focus on why growth would be a good thing. Well, firstly, as the economy grows, this means supply will increase. More is being produced. As more is being produced, generally with growth, this means that more jobs are needed. Therefore, unemployment will go down. Why is this a good thing? Well, as unemployment goes down, this means less people are on benefits and more people are working. This has a massive effect in terms of consumers have more disposable income, more spending, which increases the living standards of the general population, not only now, but in the future. Because if growth continues at a good rate, then the future living standards will get even better. So firstly, consumers have more income to spend, and therefore their living standards will increase. As growth increases, businesses are producing more, and they should be selling more as well, because demand will go up, which means that businesses will get more profits, more money, and which some of that money they might then use to invest, buy new capital, which further increases their supply and also helps the economy further. The government also benefits from growth, because as the economy is growing and we've got more people in work, then therefore less people will be on benefits, which means the government will have to spend less on benefits and will actually be receiving more in tax through to income tax and things like that. And because we've got less people unemployed, that means more people are working. So that should actually improve the income inequality within the economy, because we shouldn't, in theory, have as many poor people. We should have a lot more people who were unemployed, who were earning a very small amount of money or living off benefits, should hopefully be now earning more. I'm going to skip the environment one, because I suppose you could say if the government's got more money through growth, they could spend more on schemes to improve the environment. That is true, and I think that's a valid point, but I'm going to save the environment down for my cost. So once I've painted this amazing picture of why growth is such a good thing for the economy, now I'm going to switch it round and say the negatives. Well, if consumers have got more money because of this growth and they're spending more, unfortunately what can happen is that economic growth can actually cause inflation to rise out of control, because aggregate demand would be going up to the point where you might cause demand pull inflation. And one of the other aims that the government has is that they want to keep inflation low and steady. See, what I'm doing here is, because they're asking me about which is this the most important objective, it's a good way to try and say how doing this objective of growth would actually affect the other objectives. So I'm kind of comparing the different objectives together. So too much aggregate demand increase is going to cause demand pull inflation, which goes against the objective of low and steady inflation. I could bring in the whole environment thing. If we're growing as an economy and we're supplying more, we're producing more, we're buying more capital goods, more factories, more machinery, this is going to have a negative effect on the environment, because more production will ultimately cause more pollution, and therefore it will stop the government from reaching its aim of trying to lower environmental damage. You could also bring in the evaluation point that even though in theory income distribution should improve and we should have less of a gap between the rich and the poor because more people will be working, you could say in reality often what happens is that as an economy grows, that gap actually increases even more, and the rich get even richer and the poor will remain poor. So there's various points that you could bring out for this answer. And as you see here, they want to see that you're saying how there's a conflict between these different objectives. We've already spoken about income inequality, the environment, low and stable inflation as well. So just quickly mention this balance of payment. So the balance of payment looks at the imports and exports within the UK, and it should balance. So the amount of money spent on exports should be the same as imports. That's another one of the aims, macroeconomic aims. When we're talking about balance of payments, we're specifically also looking at the current account. That's the one that really looks at the imports and exports within the UK. Now what happens is, because we have a large propensity to import in the UK, as in we as consumers and businesses enjoy importing, we like buying from abroad, as there's a lot of growth, that can lead to an increase in importing, and if we import too much, then that's going to ruin our balance of payments, because we're going to be importing way more than we export, so things will not be balanced anymore. And that is how you would answer that 20-mark question. Now, to quickly go back to the second one, we are being asked to evaluate the use of monetary policy to achieve macroeconomic objectives. So I'm going to be talking about what this is, and I'm going to be discussing different objectives. So let's go down. So, understanding what monetary policies are. Monetary policy is the Bank of England using interest rates to control the levels of inflation. There are various macroeconomic objectives, and I'm going to discuss all the different objectives. Candidates may consider the impact of 2 objectives or the impact of 1 objective on all macroeconomic policy objectives, right? So I'm just going to focus on interest rates because it's easier to do that. Because the Bank of England also controls the amount of money that there is flowing around the economy. So if they maybe feel like they want to get people spending, they could make more money and get that to flow out into the economy. But I'm not going to focus on that. I'm just going to focus on interest rates. So if they lower interest rates, that's sometimes called loose monetary policy. So we're loosening the interest rates. If they want to increase interest rates, they sometimes call that tightening monetary policy. So we're going to focus on loose monetary policy. As monetary policy involves interest rates, loose monetary policy means we're going to lower interest rates. That means there's going to be more borrowing, consumers have more money, more disposable income. That increases aggregate demand. As demand goes up, that means that consumers will be buying more, and therefore businesses will get more money, which just cause growth. So we're linking monetary policy to the different objectives, so that can increase growth. However, as we lower interest rates, that increases aggregate demand. We've just gone about affecting inflation. So the problem is that can increase inflation. But as you say here, but inflation rates also depend on cost push inflation. So even if AD is going up, what if AS was going up as well? That would kind of counter some of the inflationary issues that we had there. But continuing, because we're saying we're cutting interest rates, that actually causes AD to go up, so more jobs, unemployment's going to fall. We've hit that objective. You can always bring in time lag, as in these things take a really long time to go into effect. growth leads to better for the budget because they're not going to have to spend as much, the government. But because we're growing, that's going to harm the environment. There are various points you could have said here. You can read the rest of them yourself.